You're looking at an unusual baton, and you know why from the video title. It's made entirely of rubber. And this video is made as a thank you in deepest gratitude to Kieran, who helped me make the book Deadly Ingenuity. So here's a bit of weapons lore that I hope you're unfamiliar with. Now, if you think rubber is a strange material choice for an impact weapon, you're right. It's not a very common one throughout the world or in world history. But let's take a closer look at the specimen we're going to play with today. Meaning, yes, we will be hitting things in this video, and I'm very curious to see how this material performs. And as you can imagine, this item is not exactly artisanal, is it? It's just factory produced. You see the dividing line where the two halves come together? And there we go. It's not fully flexible, but it has a significant amount of give. Very different from the traditional choice for a policeman's baton the world over. And what is that choice? Well, of course, wood. You cut it, you carve it, you polish it, and you are good to go. And it obviously serves the purpose because it's been used that way for a long, long time. Still is today in many countries. But as these next two images, both from my first book, show, it's the ebook version, the Kindle, and from my phone. So that's why they don't look as good as they would if they were in paper. Anyway, as they prove, there was a long history, starting in, I would say, like the early modern era, of trying to improve upon the traditional wooden billy. That meant using other materials often, and that included, as you see here, rubber. And this material seems to have found particular favor in Eastern Europe, Russia, that whole general region. Notice this advertisement here for this rubber billy club calls it a Czech rubber baton. So people from that part of the world tend to be more familiar with these, where they seem as like much more of an oddity to those in the West. This one's interesting, also a modern product, because it's actually lead-loaded. In that case, making it very much akin to the weapons family that I've spent so much time documenting on the channel and back in that first book. And in all of these synthetic billy clip choices, there's a two-part goal. One, to make it a little bit less punishing for the target. And two, importantly, to reduce the odds of the item breaking. Wooden billy clubs would, and did, sometimes break during use, and that's a real problem. Now, given their ubiquity, I think we can say it wasn't an overwhelming problem, but it could happen. And one like this, made out of fiberglass, or like the one we're looking at today, made out of rubber, all these other ones, they negate that issue. One more excerpt from my book, and you'll notice this one is all rubber and flattened, which, as I hypothesized in the book, was to prevent it from rolling around. A little point of interest on the one we're looking at today is that you can actually see the maker's mark. But it's an incredibly simple item, right? It's just a solid, rounded rod of rubber. Let's compare it to a very different kind of law enforcement baton, the Japanese jute. More than one way to skin a cat, and slightly different uses, right? When you're using today's item, carrying it in the street, then you're not a law enforcement officer who's worried about stopping someone's incoming sword, so you don't need that prong. But at the end of the day, this type of tool around the world throughout history is pretty similar. You're looking to subdue somebody, not cut their head off. Here's a vintage Gonzalez sap, very rare. So let's take a look at how the one in question performs and compare it to some of these others. Here's our target for today. You've seen me use this kind of shipping container before. Remember, these are really thick. I know it's cardboard, but it's extra, extra thick. Kind of feels like light wood. And as you can see, I've stuffed the entire length, which is considerable, with paper. So this has a little bit of heft to it. Here's our setup. And notice that piece of that stripe of blue carpenter's tape? That's going to be my target, so I can try to be consistent with striking area. And this is cool, because I really don't know what's going to happen. Just getting ready. Let's switch to slow-mo. And not bad. I mean, that's kind of what I would have expected with a baton the exact same dimensions made out of oak, I think. And that's even though you did see the rubber flex away from the target, right? It got driven back as it still drove through. And you know, as long as I brought the jute with me, let's give that a shot. What's funny is it's so much smaller, but because of the material, despite the size difference, it's significantly heavier, and it's not that much shorter if you look at it. I mean, it is, but not by much. And this material, of course, cannot yield at all, and it's much denser and harder, so is that going to equal more punishment delivered or not? overall pretty similar. Do you know what the biggest difference in this experiment was? Might not be what you're thinking. It's the amount of stress that went into my hand. This hurt, for lack of a better word, way more with the jute. It's going to be hard for you to see it on the video, but one thing inspecting the tube did show is that, as you can imagine, the steel rod did actually do more damage. So it barely, but it did indent the surface of the tube. The rubber baton did not, and this kind of proves the point of inventing and carrying this kind of a thing. It's less likely to leave a permanent injury, certainly less likely to break bone, not just because it flexes away upon impact, but it's made of a less dense material. Oh, finally found it. The exact indentation. And it is not deep. Told you, this was actually tough stuff. But most importantly, the overall results, like we said, are about the same. So, delivers enough damage to do the job, it's comparable to much more uncompromising materials, but has less hassles from a law enforcement perspective. And no reason for this video clip right here, I just need something to show while I talk, and I thought the slow motion looked kind of cool with the jute flipping in the air. And I did try a second strike, so we might as well look at it. And to reinforce the point, does the displacement here really seem that much better than with the rubber baton? The concussive force, I guess I'll call it, really does seem about the same, whereas, yeah, the peak force, the braking capability is much different. As to the question, how would you use this thing technique-wise, the answer is exactly like any other baton of similar dimensions. Strike to the inside of the knee and the collarbone, you know, whatever. But see that floppiness? Let's talk about that, because that's something we specialize in on this channel. Here's a short I published recently on the channel with a flat sap, also a semi-flexible impact weapon. And while it does negate the follow-through force that a rigid tool has, it can accelerate the object into the strike, as seen here. That snap-back motion can be really powerful. So how does that come into play with today's object? You're going to see me here smack my forearm with a swing that does not take advantage of the elasticity, and then one that does. And I'm doing my best to not skew the results here. So there was that one. And yeah, that one hurt way more, much more of a sinking feeling. It wasn't even close. Let's try the same thing on the leg. Not a big difference there. But yeah, see, once you're pushing through, you're going to lose potential impact, but that can be compensated for with the right timing, maybe even with better results. Well, on the true weakness side, stick grappling would not be a great idea with this thing. I mean, you could use it to choke, by the way, but not as good as a rigid stick. And can you block with this? You actually can. Not as well as with a rigid baton, of course, and you have to catch it lower on the rubber baton, but turns out you actually can. And lastly, thrusting would, of course, be far less effective with this flexible version of a baton. Here's one more image from my book, and this is an illustration from a story from 1929. And yes, the attacker is wielding one of our items. More of the top-heavy loaded kind, so that was obviously a thing. We saw an antique earlier. We see this illustration here, and here's another antique of the exact same type, and it'll probably surprise you. Even this kind, look at the bottom as the image becomes available. You'll see how flexible this one is. So it's not just the rod-like ones. Interesting, if you got that whipping action, that timing just right with one of those top-heavy models, wow. One more historical factoid, I read this years ago, I don't even remember where, but supposedly part of the appeal in Eastern Europe and Russia for this kind of a thing was the fact that it gets so cold in winter that wooden batons would freeze and then break upon impact. So the danger of complete, structural integrity failure, which does exist with any wooden weapon, is supposedly worse if it gets cold enough. I think that will do it for this video. Thanks again very much to Karen, and see you next time.